The first frost of the year came down on Aldermore Hall a week early, and it brought with it the smell of beeswax candles, hothouse lilies, and the cold mineral bite of stone that had stood 500 years without once growing warm. The kitchens had been at their ovens since dawn. The ballroom smelled of orange water and starch and, underneath it, faintly, of coal smoke drifting in from the grates no fire could quite outrun. Grace Milner was the kind of woman a grand house looked straight through. Not ugly, not memorable either. She had the sort of face that housekeepers liked because it did not draw a second glance from anyone who mattered, and hands that had gone red and capable from 10 years of linen and lye. She was 23, an orphan twice over, her mother dead of childbed fever, and her father dead of nothing anyone would name plainly, which was its own kind of shame in a small village. She owned 2 dresses, a Bible with her brother's name written inside the cover, and a patience that had been bought at a cost she did not discuss. The patience was the thing that mattered. It was the one skill Grace Milner had that no dancing master or drawing tutor could teach a high-born girl in a season, because it had not been taught to her either. It had been carved into her, slow year by slow year, by a brother 4 years younger than herself, a boy named Tom who hummed instead of answering, who could not bear a loud room, who lined up his wooden soldiers by height and colour, and grew frantic, truly frantic, if a careless hand disturbed the row. Tom had died 2 winters past of a fever that took stronger children too. Grace had learned, in the raising of him, how to sit very still beside someone the world called strange, and wait and let the waiting be its own kind of speech. That was the whole of what she brought to Aldermore Hall when she came into service there at 19. It was, as it turned out, exactly what the house needed, and did not know it needed. Tonight the house would hear one more thing before the candles guttered out, and nothing in it would sit quite the same after. If stories like this one find you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel before we go on. The ball had been a month in the planning, the largest Aldermore had thrown since the old Duke's funeral 3 years before, and Julian Harcourt, the present Duke, had agreed to it the way a man agrees to a tooth being drawn. Necessary, not enjoyed. His steward said the county expected it. His sister-in-law, Lady Cordelia Marsh, said his son needed to be seen in society sometime, and better sooner than later, before the whispers hardened into something no invitation could soften. His son was 7 years old and named Theodore, though almost no one but his father called him that. He was called Teddy by the 2 people in the house who loved him without qualification, and he was called other things, quieter things, by nearly everyone else. Teddy did not speak the way other boys spoke. He could recite the stations on the mail coach route from London to Bath without missing one, in order, forward and backward, and he could tell you the exact number of panes in the long gallery windows without counting them twice. But he would not answer a direct question put to him by a stranger, and loud rooms made him press both hands flat over his ears and rock, very slightly on his heels, until someone thought to take him somewhere quiet. His nurse of 4 years understood this. His nurse of 4 years had taken ill that very morning with a fever of her own, and so it fell to Grace Milner, the under-housemaid who had spent 2 years quietly minding him in odd hours when no one else would, to bring him down that night and keep him steady. She did not think of it as an honour, she thought of it as work, and work she knew how to do. She dressed him herself in the small room off the nursery wing, buttoning his coat in the same order every time, because he liked the order kept. And she told him, in the flat, unhurried voice she used only for him, exactly what would happen. There would be a great many candles. There would be music, louder than he liked, but it would come from one corner of the room, and he could stand as far from that corner as he wished. There would be people who would not speak to him, and that was Aldermore's failing, she said, not his. He looked at her sideways, the way he did when a thing pleased him, and he had no ready way to say so. He did not answer. She had not expected him to. Down in the ballroom the candles were lit 3 deep in every sconce, and the light off them was near yellow with heat. Lady Cordelia Marsh moved through the crowd in green silk the colour of a held breath, greeting every guest by name and rank without a single hesitation, because that, too, was a competence, the competence of knowing precisely who was owed what. She had been the late Duchess's sister, and she had stayed on at Aldermore after her sister died, ostensibly for the boy's sake. In practice, because a childless widow with a small income found a duke's house a comfortable place to be indispensable. She did not like the boy. She had never said so in plain words, because plain words were not her instrument, but she had said a great many things around the shape of it, to the vicar's wife, to her own maid, to anyone who would nod along. A pity, she called him. A trial. Not quite right, though of course one loved him. Julian Harcourt stood near the doors that opened onto the terrace, accepting bows and offering the fewest words a duke could offer without giving offence. He was not a handsome man in the way the season's young bucks were handsome. His nose had been broken once, badly, in a riding accident that had also taken 2 years of his youth to heal from in other ways, and his face had settled since into something hard and watchful, a face built for reading rooms rather than charming them. His eyes were a plain brown, the brown of strong tea left to steep too long, and they missed very little. He had learned, in the 3 years since his wife's death, to keep his face like a shut door in company. It was easier that way. A duke who let his feelings show was a duke the county would pick over like carrion, and his son had already given them enough to pick at. Teddy came down the great stair, with Grace Milner's hand not quite touching his shoulder, close enough that he could feel her there without being touched, which he did not like unless he chose it first. He was dressed as neatly as any boy in the room. He counted the stair treads under his breath, 16 of them, the same 16 there had always been, and something in his shoulders eased at the arriving at the expected number. The ballroom took him in with a long, cool, considering look, the sort of look a room gives a stain on good linen, and then it went back to its own business. He stood at the edge of the floor, near the doorway, where the candlelight was thinner and the music came softer through 2 rooms of distance, and he watched the dancers with an attention nobody else in that ballroom gave to anything all evening. He watched the pattern of it, the way the lines crossed and reformed, the way 4 couples became a square, and the square became a circle, and the circle broke again into 4. He did not want to dance. He wanted, Grace understood, to see the shape of it clearly, the way another child might want to solve a puzzle laid out on a table. Nobody asked him anything. Nobody offered him a chair, though his legs had begun to tire. 2 young ladies passed close enough to brush his sleeve, and did not look at him at all, the way one does not look at a coat stand. A gentleman's laugh went up somewhere behind him, too loud, too sudden, and Teddy's hands came up to cover his ears before Grace could step nearer, and he began, very softly, to rock. She did not know then that across that ballroom, a man who had spent 3 years learning to feel nothing in public was watching his son stand alone in a room full of people who owed him their bows, and gave him none of their kindness, and that something in that man, long shut, had begun very quietly to crack. Grace crossed the last few feet to Teddy's side and crouched, not touching him, until her eyes were level with his. She did not ask if he was well. She never asked him that. She said the stair count instead, low and even, 16 treads, the same as always, and she watched his hands come down from his ears, one careful inch at a time. The dance nearest them was ending. The next was being called, a slower measure, and the floor was thinning as couples caught their breath at its edges. Grace looked at Teddy's face, at the particular stillness that meant he was watching the pattern and wanting, in his own silent way, to be inside it rather than only beside it, and she made a decision that no one in that room, least of all herself, expected a housemaid to make. She rose, and she dropped him a curtsy as correct and unhurried as any she had ever given a guest of quality, and she held out her hand. "Master Theodore," she said, "will you do me the honour?" He looked at her hand for the length of 3 breaths. Then he put his own into it, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything, and he stood. She did not lead him into the crowded centre of the floor. She kept them at its very edge, in the thin space between the dancers and the doorway, where the noise was less and the eyes of the room were not, she believed, upon them at all. She matched her steps to the pattern he had been watching. Slow, 4 steps and a turn. 4 steps and a turn. Counting under her breath the way she had counted the stair treads for him, so that the counting became the dance, and the dance became something he could hold on to with both hands. He did not smile, not the way other children smiled. But he kept his hand in hers through the whole of it, and did not once cover his ears, and when the measure ended, he made a small sound, not quite a word, that she had heard perhaps 4 times in 2 years, and had learned to know as pleasure. Across the room, a duke who had not smiled without meaning to in longer than he could easily say, found that he had gone entirely still, and that his hand, resting on the back of a chair, had tightened without his leave. Grace Milner did not see him watching. She saw only Teddy's face, and the small unlooked-for gladness in it, and she thought, as she led him quietly back to the edge of the room afterward, that no one of consequence had noticed a maid overstep her place, and that the boy had had, for 4 minutes, one dance in a room that had offered him none. She was wrong about the first part. She would not learn how wrong for some time yet. The music went on. The candles burned lower, and 2 rooms away, in the doorway shadow he had chosen for exactly this purpose, so that he might watch his son's evening, without adding the weight of his own presence to it. The Duke of Aldermore stood a long while longer than he had planned to, thinking of a maid's plain curtsy, and of hands that had not once let go. Nobody stopped Grace as she brought Teddy back upstairs an hour later, his energy spent, his eyes heavy. Nobody remarked on it at all, in fact, which she took, wrongly, for a kind of forgiveness by omission. She undressed him in the same order she had dressed him, told him good night in the same flat voice, and went down to the servants' hall to eat cold meat off a chipped plate, and think no more of it than she thought of any evening's work done. Below stairs the talk was already running ahead of her. She danced with him, said one of the footmen, not unkindly, but with the particular relish servants keep for a scandal that costs them nothing. In the ballroom, in front of half the county. "She'll be turned off for it," said the cook, who liked Grace well enough, but had seen housemaids ruined for smaller presumptions. "Mark me. Lady Cordelia will have heard by breakfast." Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, said nothing at all for a long moment, which was itself a kind of statement, since Mrs. Pruitt was not a woman who lacked opinions. She had run Aldermore's household for 11 years, through a marriage, a death, and a boy nobody quite knew how to raise, and in that time she had learned exactly how much could be said in a servants' hall, and exactly how much ought to be kept for private rooms. She kept that child from a fit in front of the whole county, Mrs. Pruitt said at last, setting down her cup with more care than the cup required. I'll thank you all to remember which of those two things is the scandal. She rose from a table and did what were also her own duty. And she went up, later that night, to the small chilly parlour off his study, where the Duke sat with a single branch of candles and a glass of something he had not drunk, and she told him plainly what was being said below stairs, because that was her office, and she had never once softened a truth for him in 11 years. He listened without moving. "Is her place in danger?" he asked when she had finished. "Her place is in danger the moment my lady hears of it," Mrs. Pruitt said. "You know how she is about the boy being seen at all, let alone seen dancing with a servant." The Duke was quiet a moment. Outside the window the last carriages were rattling off down the drive, wheels loud on frosted gravel. "Her place is not in danger," he said. "See to it." Mrs. Pruitt looked at him a long moment, the way a woman looks at a man she has known through his worst years and can still occasionally be surprised by. "You saw it, then?" she said. It was not quite a question. He did not answer that directly. "Good night, Mrs. Pruitt," he said, and picked up his glass at last, and Mrs. Pruitt, who had learned exactly how much a silence could mean in that house, curtsied and left him to it. He did not go to Grace Milner and thank her. He did not so much as send word. That was not how a man like Julian Harcourt did anything, least of all a thing he had not yet decided how to feel about. But 3 mornings later, when the steward's book came before him for the quarter's wages, he found Grace Milner's name moved, without explanation, from under housemaid to nursery companion, her wage doubled, her hours in the boy's company made official rather than borrowed. No note accompanied it. No word was said to her directly at all. Grace read the change in her own wage book with plain confusion and no small alarm. She went to Mrs. Pruitt half convinced she had done something to warrant dismissal dressed up as promotion, some cruelty disguised as kindness that she had not yet understood. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No," Mrs. Pruitt agreed. "You didn't. Then who?" Mrs. Pruitt only looked at her, the long patient look of a woman who had decided, for reasons of her own, to say nothing further that morning. "His Grace runs a careful house," she said instead. "He does not waste a good pair of hands where they are needed less." Grace did not believe that was the whole truth. She was not a fool, whatever else she was. But she had learned, in 3 years of service, that the great did not explain themselves to the small, and that a wage doubled without cause was not a thing to argue with. Whatever unease it left behind it, she did not know then that the man who had signed that change to her wages had stood in a doorway 3 nights running since the ball, watching, unremarked, as she coaxed his son through the worst of an overwhelmed afternoon, with nothing but a flat voice and an endless patience, and that each time he watched he understood a little more clearly that he had been wrong, for 3 years, about what kindness looked like in his house and where it had been hiding all along. The weeks that followed took on a shape Grace had not expected and did not entirely trust. She was Teddy's now, in the plain, daily sense of it. She took her meals near his hours rather than the servants' halls, walked him in the garden when the weather allowed. Read to him from the same 3 books he preferred read in the same order, and in the quiet afternoons when the house was otherwise still, she began, almost without noticing she had begun it, to talk with the Duke. It started over nothing. A question about whether Teddy might be brought to dine, on occasion, at a smaller table rather than banished entirely from company. The Duke had asked it stiffly, as though the asking cost him something, and Grace had answered without softening. "He can bear a small table," she said. 4, perhaps 5 people, no more, and no surprises sprung on him. A large table with strangers coming and going will undo in 10 minutes what took a fortnight to build. "You speak very plainly for a girl in your position," he said, not unkindly, merely noting it. "I have found plain speech serves your son better than careful speech has ever served anyone," she said. "If you wanted flattery, your Grace, you ought to have kept the last nurse." He looked at her then with something that was almost, though not quite, the beginning of a smile. "The last nurse told me he would grow out of it," he said. "Do you believe that?" "No," Grace said. "I believe he'll grow into himself. Those are not the same thing." He was silent long enough that she thought she had overstepped badly. Then he said, "Lo, no, they are not," and something in his face eased that she did not understand, and did not ask after. She learned in pieces over those weeks the shape of his grief, though he never once handed it to her whole. His wife had found the boy's differences a mortification rather than a sorrow, had spoken of sending him away to be raised quietly out of sight before her own death made the question moot, and the Duke had spent the years since caught between grief for a wife he had not, in the end, entirely admired, and a fierce, wordless, badly expressed love for a son the world kept mistaking for a burden. He did not say all this to Grace directly. He said pieces of it, in the flat understating way he said everything, and she pieced the rest together the way she pieced together anything, by watching what a person did, rather than listening only to what they said. What he did, she began to notice, without ever being told to notice it, was quietly extraordinary. A new rug appeared in Teddy's room, thick enough to muffle footsteps, credited by the housekeeper's book to general estate improvements. A tutor arrived from London, who understood, better than the last, how to teach a boy who needed his lessons in the same order every day, and his fee was paid, Mrs. Pruitt let slip once and never again, out of the Duke's own private purse rather than the estate's. A tin soldier, the exact height and colour of the ones Teddy already owned, appeared at the foot of his bed one morning, with no note at all, simply added to the row as though it had always belonged there. "Who sent this?" Grace asked Mrs. Pruitt, holding the little soldier up. "I couldn't say," Mrs. Pruitt said, in the particular voice of a woman who could say a great deal and had chosen not to. Grace let it go. She had work to do, and a boy who needed her more than she needed answers to questions nobody in that house seemed willing to give her plainly. But she began, without quite admitting it to herself, to watch the Duke of Aldermore a little more closely than her position strictly required, and to wonder at a coldness that kept producing, in its wake, so much unaccountable warmth. The county did not let the matter rest as easily as the house had. Lady Cordelia Marsh heard of the ballroom dance within 2 days, exactly as the cook had predicted, and heard of the promotion within a week, and put the two together with the swift, cold arithmetic of a woman who had spent a decade making herself indispensable to a house she did not, in her heart, believe she could ever fully own. A servant, dancing with the air in front of the county. A servant, elevated for it rather than dismissed. It did not sit well with her, and she did not intend that it should sit well with anyone else either. She chose her moment with care, as she chose everything. It came at a small dinner some 6 weeks after the ball, a gathering of a dozen neighbouring families the Duke could not decently avoid, at which Grace, newly established as Teddy's companion, brought the boy down for the first half hour as Grace herself had suggested, to sit quietly at the table's foot before the noise and the wine grew too much for him. Teddy managed it well enough, counting the candle flames under his breath, until Lady Cordelia, seated near enough to be heard by the whole table, turned her attention deliberately to Grace. "I confess I find it remarkable," she said, in a voice pitched for an audience, "how quickly a housemaid rises in this establishment. One danced with, and the next thing, one is dining with the family. One wonders what other favours are being handed out in the nursery wing these days." The table went very still. Somewhere a fork touched a plate too loudly. Grace did not flush. She had trained herself, over 3 years of small daily cruelties, not to flush where it showed. "I was asked to bring Master Theodore down for half an hour, my lady," she said, her voice even and unhurried. "I did as I was asked. If there is impropriety in that, I confess I cannot find it." "No," Lady Cordelia said, smiling the particular smile she kept for moments like this, "I don't imagine you can. Girls of your sort rarely can see it, even when it is standing in the room with them." "Cordelia," the Duke said. "One word." Flat, final, she looked at him, surprised perhaps that he had spoken at all. And something in his face must have told her the ground had shifted more than she had accounted for, because she let the matter drop for the rest of the evening, though her eyes did not stop measuring Grace across the table for the remainder of the meal. Grace did not cry that night, though she wanted to. She sat a long while in the small room off the nursery, Teddy long asleep beside his row of soldiers, and thought that a woman with no name and no fortune had no business being spoken of in that tone at a duke's table, whatever kindness had put her there. She thought, too, though she did not let the thought go very far, of the single flat word the Duke had said in her defence, and of how much weight, for a man who wasted none of his words, that single word had seemed to carry. She did not know that upstairs, in his own cold study, the Duke sat a long while with his head in his hands, furious at his sister-in-law, and far more furious. In the quiet, unadmitted way he reserved for his worst truths, at himself, for having let 6 weeks pass, without once telling Grace Milner plainly what he had seen in that ballroom doorway, and what it had come, slowly and against every instinct he possessed, to mean to him. Lady Cordelia did not let the matter rest with one dinner's cruelty. She had learned, in a decade of managing a house she did not own, that a single blow rarely finished anything, and that patience, applied correctly, finished a great deal. She began, quietly, to write letters. To an old friend who sat on the board of a respectable institution in the north, one that specialised, its literature said, in the care and correction of children whose minds did not run along ordinary lines. To the Duke's own solicitor, phrased as a widow's natural concern for her late sister's only child, inquiring whether provisions had been made for Theodore's education, should his father, God forbid, meet some early misfortune, and whether a more structured establishment might not serve the boy better than a household run, as she put it delicately, by servants above their station. She said nothing of this to the Duke directly. She was too careful for that. She said it instead to the vicar's wife, to a cousin visiting from Bath, to anyone whose ear might carry the suggestion back to him, dressed as general concern rather than personal design, so that by the time she raised it with him herself, over a fortnight later, it would seem to him a thing already half decided by the good opinion of the county. She raised it on a wet afternoon in late autumn in his study, with the rain running grey down the long windows. "I have found a place," she said, "at Amwell House, in the north. Excellent reputation, firm, structured, precisely what a boy like Theodore needs, and precisely what he cannot get in a household given over to a housemaid's notions of how he ought to be raised. He is not going anywhere," the Duke said. "He is 7, Julian. He will not always be 7. What becomes of him at 17, raised soft by a girl who indulges every fit rather than correcting it? What becomes of the dukedom when the county already whispers that the heir is unfit and the father too soft-hearted to see it? The county's whispers are not my concern." "They will be your concern," she said, quite gently, which was somehow worse than her cruelty had been, "when they reach the point of questioning whether you are fit to hold the title in trust for him. I say this because I loved my sister, and because I do not think you see it. A servant has been permitted to shape your son's whole world. What do you imagine people say of that?" He did not answer her that day. He sent her from the room instead, and sat a long while alone with the rain, and did not, though it would cost him a great deal later, tell Grace Milner one word of what had passed. Grace felt the change in the house before anyone told her its cause. Doors that had been open to her were, without explanation, a little less open. Mrs. Pruitt's face, when Grace asked after it, held a worry she would not name. And at last, a full week after the study conversation, Grace found a letter waiting on her narrow bed, in the Duke's own hand, informing her with cold, careful, entirely correct language that in light of certain concerns raised regarding the propriety of her position, and out of consideration for young Master Theodore's future standing, it had been decided that a more conventional arrangement for his care would be sought, and that her services, while appreciated, would no longer be required past the quarter's end. There was no unkindness in the letter. That was, in its way, the cruelest thing about it. It read like a business notice, cold and correct, exactly the letter a duke would write to end an arrangement that had grown inconvenient. And nowhere in it was there one word of the ballroom, or the 6 weeks since, or anything at all that might have told her the man writing it had not in fact decided any of it freely. Grace did not weep where anyone could see her. She had had a great deal of practice not weeping where it showed. She packed her small trunk that same night, told Teddy goodbye in the flat, unhurried voice she always used with him, though her hands, folding his blanket one last time, were not quite steady, and left Aldermore Hall before the household was fully awake, believing, with the particular bitter certainty of the wrongly informed, that she had been a scandal from the start, and had finally, mercifully, been recognised as one. She did not know then that the letter she carried had not, in fact, been written freely, that the Duke had signed it under a pressure of family and reputation he had not yet found the courage to refuse outright, and that within 4 days of her leaving he would come to understand, with a violence of feeling that frightened him, exactly what he had let himself be talked into giving away. Grace took a room in the village of Little Fenning, 3 miles from Aldermore, in a cottage let by a widow who asked no questions and charged a fair price for it. She found work mending linen for the coaching inn, the same red, capable hands doing the same steady work they had always done, and told herself, in the flat voice she had once used only for Teddy, that this was no worse than the life she had expected before Aldermore had ever come into it. It was worse, and she knew it was worse, and she did not let herself dwell on why. She thought of Teddy constantly. She wondered whether the new arrangement, whatever it was, kept his lessons in the right order, whether anyone remembered that loud rooms undid him in 10 minutes what a fortnight built, whether anyone had thought to count the stair-treads with him the way she always had. She did not let herself wonder about the Duke at all, or told herself she did not, which was its own kind of lie, told daily, and daily believed a little less. It was Mrs. Pruitt who found her, a full 9 days after she had left, arriving at the cottage in Little Fenning on the housekeeper's one afternoon off, her face set in an expression Grace had never seen on it before. Something between anger and relief. "You'll want to sit down," Mrs. Pruitt said, before Grace had even properly opened the door. "I am sitting," Grace said, though she was not, and sat now, because Mrs. Pruitt's face demanded it. What Mrs. Pruitt told her, over the next half-hour, in the plain, unadorned sentences of a woman finally released from 11 years of careful discretion, undid every certainty Grace had carried out of Aldermore Hall with her small trunk. The wage that had doubled the week after the ball, not general policy as Grace had been told, but the Duke's own private order, written the morning after he had stood in that doorway and watched a housemaid dance his son through the worst evening of the boy's short life. The rug, thick enough to muffle footsteps, that Mrs. Pruitt's books had credited to estate improvements. Paid for out of the Duke's own purse, and chosen, Mrs. Pruitt said, because he had asked her, quite specifically, what softened a loud floor. The tutor from London and his fee, and the tin soldier that had appeared with no note at the foot of Teddy's bed, placed there, Mrs. Pruitt admitted at last, by the Duke's own hand, in the small hour before dawn, because he could not bear that his son should ever have to thank anyone for it, least of all himself. "He has been paying for a physician too," Mrs. Pruitt said, "a specialist, come down from London twice this past year, to learn how best the boy might be taught. He asked that his name never be given to the man's fee, told the physician's clerk to write it down as an anonymous benefactor of the parish. I only know because I keep his books, and even then he near had my head for asking." "Then why?" Grace said, and her voice for the first time in 9 days was not quite steady. "Why did he let me go? Why did he write that I was a scandal, if all of that is true?" "Because his sister-in-law is a clever woman, and he is a proud one, and pride makes even a good man a coward for a fortnight at a stretch," Mrs. Pruitt said. "But I'll tell you what else is true. He has not slept a full night since you left this house. I have run that household 11 years, and I have never seen a man look so much like he'd cut off his own hand, and then wondered, too late, what he meant to do without it." Grace sat a long while in silence, the fire in the small grate burning low, and thought of a flat, unreadable letter, and of a rug she had never thought to question, and of a man who had watched her, from a doorway she had never once looked toward, longer than she had ever imagined being watched by anyone at all. "He should have told me," she said at last. "Whatever he felt, whatever he was afraid of, he should have told me himself, and let me choose, rather than writing me a letter like a debt called in." "He knows that now," Mrs. Pruitt said. "I dare say it's the first thing he has known clearly in a fortnight. She did not know then, sitting in that small, cold parlour with the fire burning down, that the Duke of Aldermore was, at that very hour, informing his sister-in-law in terms that left no further room for argument that Amwell House would not have his son, that her letters to the north were to cease, and that he intended, whatever it cost him in county opinion or family peace, to go himself to Little Fenning, and tell a housemaid the truth he ought to have told her a great deal sooner. He came the following afternoon, without a carriage, without a footman, on foot the 3 miles from Aldermore, in a coat too thin for the cold, because he had left before he could talk himself out of it, and had not thought to send for anything grander. Grace's landlady let him into the small front parlour with the particular flustered courtesy reserved for dukes who arrive unannounced at cottage doors, and left the two of them alone with the fire, and a silence neither seemed in any hurry to break. He looked, Grace thought, older than he had looked a fortnight before. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there at the ball, and his hands, when he finally spoke, were not entirely steady either, which surprised her more than anything else about the visit. "I did not come here to ask you back," he said. "I came here to tell you the truth, and then to leave the rest of it entirely to you." "Then tell it," Grace said. "I have had enough of half-truths dressed as kindness." He was quiet a moment, gathering himself the way a man gathers himself before a thing he has rehearsed and still finds difficult to say plainly. "My name is Julian," he said. "You have never once used it. I would like you to know it before I say the rest, because I do not think a duke ought to confess anything to a woman who is not permitted to call him by his own name." Grace said nothing. Her hands, folded in her lap, had gone very still. "I watched you," he said, "at the ball. I stood in the doorway of the card-room because I could not bear to watch my son stand alone in a room that owed him better, and I did not think anyone would ask him for a dance, because no one ever had. And then you did. You did not know I was watching. You did not do it for reward, or for notice, or because you thought it would raise you in this house. You did it because he needed it, and no one else in that room would give it to him. I wanted to see what a person did when they believed no one of consequence was watching. That is the only test that ever tells the truth about anyone. You passed it before I had even properly learned your name. You could have told me that," Grace said, "instead of doubling my wages in silence and letting me think it a state policy." "I could have," he agreed. "I was afraid to." A duke who admits he has been watching a housemaid with his whole unguarded heart is a duke who has handed the county a weapon, and I had already handed them one weapon in my son. I told myself I was protecting you both. I have since had a great deal of time to consider that I was mostly protecting myself, and that it cost you 9 days of believing yourself dismissed as a scandal, which you never were, not for 1 hour, not in my house or in my own mind. And the letter, Grace said, the letter that sent me away, was written under my sister-in-law's persuasion and my own cowardice, in equal measure, he said. I signed it believing, for 1 very bad week, that it was the safer course for Teddy. I have since understood that safety bought at the cost of the one person who has ever truly seen my son is no safety at all, only a slower kind of loss. Amwell House will not have him. My sister-in-law's letters have stopped, and I have come here to tell you all of it plainly, and then to ask nothing of you at all, because I think you have been asked to give quite enough to this family without also being asked to forgive it on demand. Grace sat a long while with that, the fire cracking softly in the grate, a single crow calling once outside the window and going silent. I am not owed an apology dressed as a confession, she said at last. I am owed the truth spoken plainly, from the start, the next time there is a truth to speak. If you can give me that, the rest I find I can forgive rather more easily than I expected to. I can give you that, he said. I would rather have your honest no freely given than a yes you felt pressed into by gratitude or pity for a duke who came walking 3 miles in a thin coat. I am not asking you tonight. I am asking you to take whatever time you need, and to know that whatever you decide, Teddy's place in your life, and yours in his, does not depend on what you decide about me." Grace looked at him a long moment, at the shadows under his eyes, and the careful, unpractised honesty of a man who did not know how to ask for anything, without also handing back the right to refuse it. "I should like to see him," she said. "Whatever else, I should like to see him first." "He asks for you every day," Julian said, and something in his voice, for the first time since he had entered the room, was not entirely steady either. "He has not stopped counting the stairs since you left. He counts them, and then he waits, as though the number might bring you back if he says it correctly enough." Grace's own composure, held so carefully through 9 days and a village and a stranger's cottage, broke then, quietly, without sound. 2 tears she did not bother to hide, because there was no longer, in that small warm room, anyone left to hide them from. "Take me home," she said. "I want to count the stairs with him myself." She came back to Aldermore Hall 2 days later, not as a housemaid and not yet as anything the county had a proper name for, but simply as the one person Teddy Harcourt ran to. The moment he saw her crossing the gravel drive, faster than she had ever seen him run to anyone, his small arms coming around her waist without warning, and without her having to ask permission of him first, which she understood, better than anyone else in that house could have understood it, as the truest welcome he knew how to give. The Duke did not press her for an answer in the weeks that followed, exactly as he had promised. He came to the nursery of an evening as he always had, and spoke to her as he always had, plainly, without ornament, and let the matter of what lay between them sit quiet and unhurried, the way Grace had once let Teddy's own silences sit unhurried, trusting that what was true would surface in its own good time rather than being forced. It surfaced on an evening in early winter, the first real snow of the year lying thin and blue-white on the terrace, when Julian found her in the small parlour off the nursery, a fire lit, Teddy long asleep, and asked her, at last, the only question he had been careful, all these weeks, not to ask. "Have you had time enough?" he said. Grace set down her mending. "I have had time enough to know I was never owed an apology," she said. "I have had time enough to know that a man who pays a physician's fee under another name and gives his son a soldier before dawn so the boy need never feel obliged to thank him, is not, whatever his cowardice about county opinion, a small man. I loved Teddy before I ever thought to consider you at all. I find, now, that I have gone and loved his father as well, somewhere in the counting of stairs and the watching from doorways, and I did not ask permission for that any more than you asked mine." "Then say the word," Julian said, "and I will not ask you twice, and I will not need you to say it prettily." "Yes," Grace said, "it is the only word I find I need." He crossed the small room to her, slow, the way he did everything that mattered, and took her right hand in both of his, and drew the worn glove from it finger by finger, so unhurried it was almost its own kind of vow, until her bare hand lay in his, red-knuckled and capable and entirely her own, and he bent and kissed it once, plainly, the way a man kisses a promise rather than a prize. "Grace Milner," he said, "I have watched a great many people in this house pretend to virtues they did not own. I have never once watched you pretend to anything. That is the whole of why I love you, and I would have you know it had nothing at all to do with a ballroom, or a rescue, or anything you ever did for my sake. It had to do with what you did for a boy who could give you nothing back, when you believed no one was there to see it." From the doorway, unnoticed by either of them until he spoke, Teddy, who had woken and padded down the corridor in his nightshirt to see why the candle still burned, said, in the plain, flat voice he used for facts he considered self-evident, "You are holding hands. That is what people do before a wedding. I read it in a book." Julian looked at his son, startled into something that was, for the first time in longer than Grace had known him, an open and unguarded laugh, and Grace laughed with him, surprised into it, the sound of it filling the small warm room the way the fire filled it, entirely and without effort. "He is not wrong," Julian said. "He is very rarely wrong about anything he has read. Lady Cordelia Marsh did not stay at Aldermore Hall to see the banns read. She removed herself, with what dignity she could still muster, to a house in Bath within the month, her letters to the north quietly withdrawn, her name spoken of afterward at Aldermore only rarely, and never unkindly, which was Mrs. Pruitt observed once, a good deal more mercy than the woman had ever shown in return. The wedding itself was a quiet one, by a duke's standards, held in the small parish church rather than in London, attended by neighbours who had, in the months since the ball, come slowly to understand what sort of woman had been living quietly among them all along, mending linen and counting stairs and asking nothing at all for herself. A year later, on an evening much like the one that had begun it all, Julian and Grace sat before the fire in the same small parlour off the nursery, her bare hand in his, and did not let go of it, and Teddy, older now and steadier for it, sat nearby lining his soldiers by height in the last of the firelight, humming a tune he had learned from the stable boy, and would not, for love or money, tell anyone the name of. "Do you remember the stairs?" Julian asked her once, quietly watching the fire. "I remember all 16 of them," Grace said, "and I mean to go on remembering them a good deal longer yet. Outside a single rook called once in the bare trees and went still, and the snow came down soft and even over Aldermore Hall, settling the way it always had, slow and heavy and sure, over a house that had finally, after all its long careful silences, learned to say plainly what it meant. A kindness given where none is owed, and none is watched for, is the only proof of a heart that a title, a fortune, or a season's gossip can never buy. That is where we leave Grace and Julian and Teddy tonight, by their fire, with the snow still falling outside, and nothing left unsaid between them. If a story about a boy the world walked past, and a woman who stopped for him anyway, moved you even a little, I hope you will subscribe to the channel, so you never miss the next one. I would love to know, in the comments, what you think truly changed Julian that night in the ballroom doorway, and whether you believe a person's character is best measured by what they do when they know no one is watching at all. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. Come back soon, and I will have another story waiting for you by the fire.